Why don't I take a couple of questions and then we'll visit afterwards. Well, I think we're short on time. Normally I like to do a bunch of questions, but I want to be respectful of the calendar, so let's maybe do 2. Yes, ma'am.
Senator, why have we, as a Congress, been completely neutered of power, and Obama continues to mandate? Why is that?
Linda, you are exactly right. The answer is simple, because our leaders aren't listening to us. I have said for a long time,
The Harry Reids, the John Boehners, I mean, who's...
the biggest divide we have in Congress, and politically in this country, is not between Republicans and Democrats. The biggest divide we have in this country is between career politicians in Washington in both parties and the American people. So let me give a specific manifestation. Look, there is a corruption. It's a bipartisan corruption in Washington. It's what I call the Washington cartel.
Okay.
It is career leaders in both parties who listen to the lobbyists, and they always stand together to grow the power of Washington. And to disregard what the people are told. So, for example, when we launched our campaign for president on March 23rd at Liberty University, the next day the New York Times said Cruz cannot win because the Washington elites despise him. I kind of thought that was the whole point of the campaign. And Linda, what I'm telling folks across Iowa and across the country is if you think things are going great in Washington, if you think we just need to fiddle around the edges but not change the basic trajectory, then I ain't your guy. But if you think it's fundamentally corrupt, that there are too many leaders who aren't listening, that we need to take power out of Washington and bring it back to we the people, that's what this campaign is all about. Let me give you an illustration of that. We won an historic victory in November. Iowa, thankfully, sent us Joni Ernst, who Joni is a rock star, and thank you, Iowa, for doing that. By the way, I've noticed that Democratic male senators shift very uncomfortably when Joni confronts them on anything.
Good.
That's a good sign.
Yeah.
Immediately following that election, what happened? Republicans joined with Democrats to pass a $1 trillion omnibus plan that was filled with corporate welfare and pork and spending and did nothing to honor the commitments that were made to the men and women in this country. Now, I stood up and fought against that and was excoriated by colleagues on both sides of the aisle. I'll tell you a conversation I had with leadership afterwards. I said, look, I understand the desire to pay off the lobbyists and special interests on K Street who wrote checks in the campaign. I don't agree with it, but I understand it. It's not irrational. But I said, I have a suggestion. How about we treat with at least as much seriousness the promises made to the men and women who elected us and just gave us a majority in the Senate? Just retired Harry Reid. This last election, senators and Senate candidates campaigned and said, if you give us a Senate majority, we will, number one, do everything humanly possible to stop the train wreck that is Obamacare. And number two, we will stop President Obama's unconstitutional executive amnesty. And the response I got was very matter of fact. I never said that. Well, I can tell you right now, a whole bunch of Senate candidates across this country did. Because I was standing next to them for 2 months on the campaign trail. And that's why people are fed up. They get that our leaders are lying to us. That they're not telling us the truth. And your question is, how do we change that? You know, you don't change it within Washington. I think we've got a parallel that's a very encouraging parallel. Book of Ecclesiastes tells us there's nothing new under the sun. I think where we are today is very, very much like the late 1970s. Parallels between Barack Obama and Jimmy Carter are uncanny. Same failed economic policy, same misery, stagnation, and malaise. Same feckless and naive foreign policy. In fact, the exact same countries, Russia and Iran, openly laughing at and mocking the President of the United States. You know, the one person in America thrilled with the job Barack Obama's doing is Jimmy Carter. The reason that analogy gives me so much encouragement and hope and optimism as we remember how that story ends. That there was a grassroots movement that swept this country of millions of men and women who rose up and became the Reagan Revolution. And it didn't come from Washington. Washington despised Ronald Reagan. If you see a candidate who Washington embraces, run and hide. Came from the American people, and what it did is it changed the rules. Look, in 1978, 1979, Reagan didn't fly to Washington and sit down with the old bulls, the Republicans in Congress, and say, come on, guys, we got to stand for something. You know what? In 78 and 79, the Republicans weren't listening to the men and women who elected them either. It was the same problem. The bipartisan corruption of Washington. What Reagan did is he changed the rules. He took the case to we the people, and he swept in with a tidal wave. And suddenly the incentives changed. You know, there's an old joke that politics is Hollywood for ugly people. My wife tells me I resemble that. How do you change Washington fundamentally? How do you get elected officials to listen to us? You come out of 2016 with a mandate from the people. I intend to make 2016 a referendum on repealing Obamacare, on abolishing the IRS, and you make it so for elected officials, it's politically more risky to do the wrong thing than to do the right thing. That's the only way to make D.C. listen. That's why this campaign is focused directly on courageous conservatives, the grassroots, because we the people is the only force powerful enough to change Washington. All right, last question. Yes?
Senator, we have a lot of people running for office. We added 2 more this week.
I hadn't noticed.
But I noticed that there are kind of 3 different skill sets. You've got senators, you've got governors, and you've got 2 business people. What's the best skill to have when you're running for office? Or when you're in office, not when you're running?
A great question. So there are right now, I think, 146 candidates running.
Right.
But by the end of it, you may need a phone book to tell us all apart. And Ralph, I did kind of like it when you noted that the good people of Iowa, that the presidential candidates are descending upon you. It sort of envisioned the scene from the Ten Commandments where the locusts and the plague came. And I hope we're not followed by frogs and the water turning to blood, but no promises. How do you distinguish? And so one question that gets repeated a lot is governors versus senators. And let me address that for a second. You know, you hear that argument a lot right now. It's worth stepping back and actually viewing that argument in historical context. That argument, some years has been pushed by Washington, some years it hasn't. So in 1980, the conservative choice in 1980 was a governor, Ronald Wilson Reagan. Nobody from Washington said, we need a governor. Then they said, we need a former congressman named George Herbert Walker Bush. Fast forward to 1996. In 1996, the moderate choice in the race was Bob Dole, a senator. No one from Washington said, we need a governor. Then we need a statesman from the Senate, Bob Dole. Fast forward to 2008. Then the more moderate choice in the race was John McCain. Nobody said we need a governor in 2008. Then we need a lion of the Senate, John McCain. Now in 2016, it happens that most of the moderate candidates are governors. So what happens? Every pundit on Fox News about 5 times a day says, it's got to be a governor. Got to be a governor. Got to be a governor. You hear that constantly from the Washington echo chamber, from the Washington cartel. If you look historically, about an equal number of presidents have been senators and governors. The truth is we've had good ones and bad ones who were both. Jimmy Carter was a governor. Jimmy Carter was a trainer. Barack Obama is not a bad president because he was a senator. Barack Obama is a bad president because he's an unmitigated socialist and a rabid ideologue who's dramatically weakened our constitutional rights and America's leadership in the world. Here's the test I think we should apply. How do you distinguish between all these candidates, particularly when everyone will say they're conservative on every issue? I think the test is the one I mentioned a minute ago. Show me. Let me encourage each of you. Go home and make a list of the 10 or 12 biggest and most important battles of the last few years. For you, ask yourself, what issues mattered the most to you? And then for each of the other candidates, ask, where have they stood and led on those issues? So if you say you oppose Obamacare, great. Show me where you stood up and led to stop it. If you say you oppose the debt and debt ceiling that are bankrupting our kids and grandkids, fantastic. Show me where you've stood and led to do something about it. If you say you oppose President Obama's unconstitutional executive amnesty, show me your record of standing and fighting to stop it. If you say you support the First Amendment, free speech, and religious liberty, where were you in Indiana? That time of choosing, did you stand or did you flee? If you say you support the Second Amendment, where were you when President Obama and Harry Reid tried to come after our right to keep and bear arms? If you say you support the Fourth and Fifth Amendments, our rights to privacy, what have you done to end the federal government's bulk collection of phone metadata of law-abiding citizens? If you say you support the 10th Amendment, what is your record of standing up to stop Common Core? And did you have the record before, or is this suddenly a position you discovered when you launched your presidential campaign? If you say you support life and marriage, when have you stood up and defended life and marriage, particularly when our friends in the media excoriate you for defending the basic values upon which this country was built? If you say you support Israel, when have you stood and led strengthening our friendship and relationship with the nation of Israel? If you say you oppose radical Islamic terrorism and Iran getting nuclear weapons, what is your record of leading and fighting on those issues? Now, I've just given you my list of about a dozen, I think, the biggest fights of the last several years. And I can tell you on every one of those issues, I have endeavored with every breath in my body to lead the fight, to fight for our principles. And I think that's the biggest distinction in this race, is who has a proven record of standing up over and over again. And here's another way of looking at it. Show me when you stood up to Washington. And not just Democrats. When have you stood up to Republicans? Linda, going back to your question. Every one of these candidates, you ought to ask, show me, when have you stood up to Republicans in Washington? Now, there may be a few who can say, well, I stood up from the left, I went and embraced amnesty. Okay, they can go with that answer. When you take on Republicans from the left, the mainstream media sings your praises. You were a wise, enlightened statesman anytime you agree with the Democrats over Republicans. Show me where you've taken on Republicans standing for conservative principles with the people against the Washington cartel. And I think there's a dramatic difference between my record and that of the records of the other people in this race. There are a lot of good, talented people who I like and respect. But at the end of the day, I think the men and women of Iowa are going to say, show me your record. And I think on that, there's sharp differences. Thank you, guys. God bless you.
Thank you, Senator. We appreciate the words. You know, like a lot of you that I see probably were in the same boat that I was. I saw those debates in the late 1970s. I saw that statement where a man on the end said, I paid for this microphone. Remember that? Yeah, you bet. And because he was being pushed out by the establishment. That's why I'm supporting Senator Cruz and his efforts to run for the presidency, because I believe in what he says. I believe that he is speaking from the heart.